What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards, old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. This week on Not Your Average Meta, we're bringing you another exciting game we filmed on at the Hobby Horse. Speaking of which, we'd like to shout out our second full-time channel sponsor for Season 3 of the Hobby Horse. If you're ever in the Central Illinois area, be sure to stop in and check out the store as well as saying hi to Martin. This week's matchup features Martin playing as Boros commander, General Ferrous Rokiric, Patrick back again playing Zexara the Exemplary, Foggerl playing the new Jor Kadeen first Goldwarden, and Foil playing his alchemy turned paper commander, Rusko Clockmaker. Now leave our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Martin plays a tapped Sacred Foundry, while Patrick plays a tapped Mosswort Bridge, looking at his top 5 cards and then hiding one away under his land. Fog plays a Terramorphic Expanse and then cracks to go get a tapped Mountain, while Foil draws and plays an Island for turn. Martin plays a Mountain for turn and then pays 2 to cast Bard, Argivian Recruiter. Patrick plays an untapped Botanical Sanctum for turn, then pays 2 to cast an Arcane Signet. Fog plays a Plains for turn and then also pays 2 to cast his commander, Jor Kadeen, first Goldwarden. Foil plays a Swamp for turn, then also has a turn 2 play, casting an Arcane Signet. Martin plays a Plains for turn, then goes to combat, swinging Baird at Fog for 2 damage. He then taps out and casts his commander, General Ferrous. Patrick plays a Shipwreck Marsh for turn, then also taps out to cast his commander, Zexara. Fog plays another Plains for turn, then pays 2 to cast a Citizen's Crowbar, which creates him a 1/1 Citizen token. He then goes to combat, swinging his commander, Martin, for 3 commander damage. Foil plays another Island for turn, then pays 4 to cast his commander, Rusko Clockmaker, which then creates him a Midnight Clock when he enters play. Martin plays a Mountain for turn and then casts a Figure of Destiny, which triggers his commander, creating a 4/4 Golem token. He then pays 3 more and casts a Sky Knight Legionnaire, which then triggers his commander once again, creating him another Golem. He then goes to combat, swinging 1 creature at Fog and swinging 1 creature at Foil, which then deals 2 damage to each of them. Patrick plays Rejuvenating Springs for turn and then pays 4 to cast Garruk Wildspeaker. He then upticks Garruk to untap 2 of his lands before he then casts an Everflowing Chalice, kick twice. He then casts a Cultivate to go get 2 lands from his library and passes his turn. Fog plays a Mycosynth Gardens for turn before he casts a Kimba's Banner, which creates him a 2/2 Rebel token. He then goes to combat and swings Jor Kadeen and Garruk, taking him out of the game, which then triggers, allowing him to draw a card since his commander's power is 4 or greater. Foil upticks his clock and then draws for turn before he plays a Fabled Passage. He then casts an Ominous Seas, which deals 1 damage to each of his opponents while he gains a life, before he then casts a Mind Stone, which deals another damage to his opponents while he gains another life. Martin draws and then casts a 10th District Legionnaire, which triggers his commander and gives him a 3rd Golem token. Martin then goes to combat, swinging a Sky Knight Legionnaire at Foil for 2 damage while he swings the rest of his creatures at Patrick, taking him down to 22 life. He then casts a Lorehold Apprentice, which creates him another Golem token while he passes turn. Patrick draws for turn and plays a Swamp, while Foil cracks his Fabled Passage in order to go get a land from his library to put into play. Patrick then taps out and casts an Aaliyah's Intervention, where X is equal to 8, in order to go get 8 lands from his library to put into his hand. This then triggers his commander, creating him an 8/8 Hydra token, and he passes turn. Fog plays a Mountain for turn and then he pays 3 in order to equip his banner to his commander. Fog then goes to combat, swinging his pumped up commander at Foil, who doesn't block and takes the 5 commander damage, while Fog draws off his commander's triggered ability. Foil plays an Island for turn and then casts a Windfall, which causes each of his opponents to then lose a life while he gains a life, before each of them then discards their hands and they all draw 7 new cards. This then puts 7 counters on his Ominous Seas, and he pays 2 to cast Teferi's Time Twister, which deals a damage to each of his opponents once again while he gains a life, and puts a 12th counter on his Midnight Clock. This then triggers his clock and he shuffles his hand and graveyard into his library before he draws 7 new cards and adds 7 more counters to his Ominous Seas. His Time Twister then resolves and he uses it to bounce his commander in order to create another Midnight Clock before passing turn. Martin draws for turn, then plays a Plains before he pays 3 in order to cast a Durgar Hedge Mage. He then uses this to destroy Fog's banner as well as destroying Foil's Ominous Seas. In response, Foil casts a Blur in order to flicker his commander, deal a damage to each of his opponents, gain a life, draw a card, add another counter to his Ominous Seas before he then removes the counters from his Ominous Seas in order to create 2 Kraken tokens, and then create another Midnight Clock when his commander enters play again. Martin then goes to combat and swings his Legionnaire foil in the air once again for 2 more damage and 4 of his Golem tokens at Patrick. Patrick blocks one of the tokens with his commander and then takes the rest of the damage, going to 7 life. Martin then casts a Boros Challenger, which creates him another Golem token. Patrick plays a Force for turn and then activates his Bridge, which has him put into play Nissa Who Shakes the World. He then animates one of his lands with Nissa before he casts a Genesis Wave where X is equal to 8. This then triggers his commander, creating him another 8/8 Hydra before he then reveals the top 8 cards of his library. He then puts to play a handful of lands as well as a Nyxbloom Ancient, a Benthic Druid, and a From Beyond. He then scries 1 card off his Temple entering play before he taps out in order to cast a Blue Sun Zenith where X is equal to 8. This then triggers his commander, which creates him another 8/8 Hydra before he then draws 8 cards and shuffles the Zenith back into his library. He then goes to combat and swings one of his Hydras at Fog, who chumps with a Rebel token. Fog plays another Plains for turn before paying 5 to cast Lothari, Sun's Glory. He then goes to combat, swinging his Phoenix at Martin for 3 damage, which then creates him 1 Rebel token and gives him an experience counter. Martin then can't block and takes 2 damage while Fog gains 3 life. On his end step, Foil casts a Vampiric Tutor to go get a card to put on top of his library. Foil then casts a Consider to put a counter on each of his clocks while dealing a damage to each of his opponents and gaining a life, before he then draws a card that he just tutored for. Foil then draws for turn and plays an island before he pays 4 in order to cast a Damnation. Each opponent then loses a life and he gains a life before all the creatures then get wiped off the board. Second main phase, Foil pays enough to cast his commander again, creating a Midnight Clock when he enters play. Martin draws and then plays another Plains for turn before paying 5 in order to recast his commander a second time. Patrick gets a Spawn token from Foil on his upkeep before he then casts Wildest Dreams where X is equal to 1 in order to return a card from his graveyard to his hand. Patrick then turns one of his Force into a creature before he casts a Nyxbloom Ancient, a Birds of Paradise, and a Paradise Druid. Patrick then casts a Kicked Inscription of Abundance, which has him putting 2 +1/+1 counters on his Nyxbloom, which he then chooses to have fight Foil's commander while he gains 7 life. Patrick then casts a Kicked Skyclave Relic, which has it entering play with 2 tapped token copies. Fog plays a Mountain for turn before he then pays to recast his commander a second time, along with Queen Kayla Ben Krug. Foil upticks all of his clocks on his upkeep, which then has one of his clocks going off with 12 counters on it. He then shuffles his hand and graveyard back into his library before drawing a fresh new 7 cards and drawing a card for turn. He then pays 1 to cast a Ponder so he can look at the top 3 cards of his library, and then he puts them back in any order before he then draws a card. He then pays to cast a Merchant Scroll, which allows him to go to his library and get Cyclonic Rift, which he then puts to hand before casting it for his overload cost, bouncing all the permanents in play back to his opponent's hands. Martin untaps and draws for turn before playing another Mountain. He then recasts his commander from his hand before paying to cast a Venerable Warsinger, which creates him another 4/4 Golem token. He then decides to read what his card actually does before he passes his turn to Patrick. Patrick draws and then recasts his Nissa before he also recasts his Birds of Paradise, his Paradise Druid, and his Skyclave Relic. He then turns one of his Force into a creature again before he then casts his Everflowing Chalice, kicked once. Fog plays a Castle Embereth for turn before he then pays to recast his commander from his hand, as well as an Ancestral Blade, which creates him a 1 white soldier creature token. He then also recasts his Citizen's Crowbar, which creates him a 1/1 citizen token before passing turn. Foil adds another counter to his Midnight Clock on his upkeep before he then draws for turn. He then casts a Chasm Skulker before he then pays 2 life to cast a Phyrexian Metamorph, which comes into play as a Chasm Skulker. He then also casts a Spark Double, which he chooses to come into play as a 3rd copy of a Chasm Skulker. Martin plays a Mountain for turn and then casts a Boreas Battle Shaper, which creates him a 4/4 Golem token. Martin then goes to combat, deciding to swing his Golem and 2 of his other creatures at Nissa, which Patrick decides not to block, allowing Nissa to go to the graveyard. Patrick draws for turn, then pays to recast his Nyxbloom Ancient, which Foil tries to counter with a Pact of Negation, before Patrick then counters that with a classic counterspell. Patrick then casts Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, which has him gaining 3 life and drawing a card before he then puts him into his graveyard. He then casts Thassa, God of the Sea, as well as recasting his From Beyond. Fog plays on land for turn and then casts a Roar of Resistance. He then goes to combat and activates a Roar of Resistance in order to pump up his commander, who he then swings at Patrick for 5 commander damage. Patrick then doesn't block and this triggers his commander, which has him drawing a card. On his upkeep, Foil adds a counter to his clock, which has it going off and has him shuffling his hand and graveyard into his library once again, which then adds a bunch of counters to each of his Chasm Skulkers. He then draws for turn, which adds another counter to each of the Chasm Skulkers before he plays a Choked Estuary, revealing a swamp from his hand. Foil then casts a Preordain in order to scry 2 cards to the bottom of his library before he draws a card. And in response, Patrick sacrifices his From Beyond in order to go get an Eldrazi card from his library. Foil then casts a pair of Lightning Greaves as well as casting a Dimir Signet. He then casts a Reality Shift in order to exile Patrick's Nyxbloom Ancient before going to combat and swinging one of his creatures at him to take him out of the game. He then equips the original Chasm Skulker with his Lightning Greaves and passes. Martin draws and then goes to combat, swinging 3 of his creatures at Foil, who blocks one of them but still takes 8 damage from the golems. He then casts his own Caleb Ben Krug, which creates him another golem token, as well as casting a Showdown of the Skulls, which creates him another golem token. He then exiles his top 4 cards of his library to his saga, and on his end step, Fog casts your Temple is under attack, choosing Martin and himself to both draw 2 cards. Fog plays with Plains for turn and then pays 2 to sack his land in order to draw another card. Fog then casts a Hex Gold Hullbard, which creates him a 2/2 Rebel token, before he then goes to combat and Martin chooses to have his citizen have to attack, as well as not allowing Foil's Metamorph to block. In response, Fog chooses to tap his citizen and sack his crowbar in order to destroy Foil's Lightning Greaves. Foil draws for turn and adds a counter to each one of his Skulkers, before he then pays to recast a Windfall, which has each of his opponents once again discarding their hands and drawing 7 cards. This then adds 7 more counters to each of his Skulkers. Foil then casts a Nettle Cyst, which creates him a 0/0 Germ token before going to combat, and Martin chooses to have Fog's Rebel not be able to block while making one of Foil's Skulkers have to attack. In a surprise turn of events, Foil then goes to combat and swings his Skulker at Martin, who just chump blocks with one of his creatures. Martin draws and then plays the Plains from his exile pile before he then casts a Boreal Skilled Mage, which puts a counter on one of his golems as well as creating him another golem. He then casts a Mana Vault, which puts a counter on another one of his golems before he then casts a Spark Trooper, which puts another counter on a golem and creates him another golem token. Martin then casts a Legion's Initiative, and in response, Foil casts a Drown in the Lock in order to destroy Martin's Boreas Battle Shaper. Martin then goes to combat and swings out with all of his creatures at Foil, who blocks as many of the creatures as he can but still takes 6 damage. On his end step, Fog pays 4 and taps an untapped Rebel he controls in order to bring Othari back from his graveyard into play tapped. Fog plays a Plains for turn, and then he pays to cast a Shram Senior Edificer before casting Barbed Batterfist, which creates him another 2/2 Rebel as well as drawing him a card off the Shram trigger. He then casts a Bloodforged Battle Axe and pays in order to equip it to Othari before he then casts Reav Master Smith and remembers he's supposed to draw off his Shram trigger. He then goes to combat and swings Othari and his commander at Martin, which then gives him another experience counter and creates him 2 Rebel tokens that come into play tapped and attacking. Martin then blocks the 2 tokens and Fog draws off his commander's trigger before Martin decides to take the rest of the commander damage as well as taking the 10 damage, which has Fog gaining 10 life. Fog then creates another Battle Axe, and on his end step, Foil casts an Opt in order to scry 1 card and then draw. Foil then adds another counter to each of his squids before he then draws for turn and pays 4 in order to recast Damnation. In response, Fog casts a Flawless Maneuver in order to give his board indestructible while the rest of the creatures get wiped off the board, and Foil creates 52 squid tokens. Foil then pays to recast his commander a 3rd time, which creates a Midnight Clock when he enters play, before he then pays to equip his commander with his Nettle Cyst. Martin takes the damage on his upkeep and then draws for turn, before he then pays to recast his commander a 3rd time. He then pays to cast a Sacred Fire, dealing 2 damage to Rayap, which creates him a 4/4 Golem token and has him gaining 2 life. Fog plays a Mount for turn, and then he casts a Glimmer Lens, creating a 2/2 Rebel token when it enters play, before he then casts an Intangible Virtue and once again remembers he's supposed to be drawing off his SRAM trigger. He then pays to equip his other Battle Axe to his commander before he then goes to combat, swinging Jor Kadeen at Martin, as well as swinging Othari at foil. Martin then decides not to block and takes the commander damage, while foil takes the 5 damage in the air. Fog then gains 5 life and creates 2 more copies of his Bloodforged Battle Axe before drawing off his commander's trigger. Foil draws for turn and then pays 2 life to cast a Cataxian Probe targeting Fog, who in response casts Call the Coppercoats targeting Foil, which creates him 53 human soldier tokens. Foil then looks at Fog's hand and draws a card before he then pays to crack his Mind Stone in order to draw another card. Foil then casts a Psychic Corrosion and passes his turn. Martin loses a life on his upkeep and then draws for turn before he casts a Swiftblade Vindicator, creating another 4/4 Golem token. He then pays to flash back his Sacred Fire in order to destroy Fog's commander while he gains 2 more life. Fog plays a Plains for turn and then casts a Semblance Anvil, imprinting an artifact when he enters play. He then casts a discounted Hexblade Wallbreaker, creating another Rebel token when he enters play and drawing a card. Fog then pays to equip the Wallbreaker to Othari, and at this point the rest of the table knows with double combat the game's over, so they scoop the game up to Fog. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.